I found the original notarized contract sewn into the lining of a battered ukulele case, and that discovery didn't just void a $500,000 sale. It ended with my daughter sanding fretboards in a shirt that reads, "Strumming Lies," while every instrument ships with a QR code that links directly to her perjury conviction. I'm a luthier by trade, a word that still feels too fancy for what I actually do, which is listen to wood and coax a voice out of it. By the time my daughter Kayla graduated with a business degree, I'd spent 30 years as a seamstress in an upholstery shop, my hands steady enough to blind stitch a French seam on a leather sofa, but my heart always dreaming of tone resonance and bracing angles. My mother Mabel taught me both skills. She said thread and tension hold the world together, whether it's a dress or a dovetail joint. When Kayla came home with a spreadsheet and a pitch, a bespoke ukulele workshop, high-end, custom inlay direct-to-consumer, I drained my entire $401k, $110,000, and handed it to her. We would be equal partners, 50-50, notarized and witnessed. I insisted on that. My mother, before she passed, helped me sew a hidden pocket into the lining of a deluxe concert ukulele case I had built for my first grandchild. She said paper can get lost, but stitching remembers. I duplicated every important document with a needle and thread and tucked them inside that case, a habit I never told Kayla about. It was just a quiet insurance policy, the kind of thing a woman who spent her life mending other people's furniture knows to do. The day the betrayal landed started like any other. I was in my workshop, sanding the back brace of a curly mango tenor with 220 grit paper, my fingers white with dust. The mail slot clattered. I wiped my hands on my apron and walked over to find a certified envelope from an attorney I didn't recognize, return address in the same strip mall as my son-in-law Brad's real estate office. I tore it open standing at the bench. Inside was a short letter titled, "Notice of Dissolution," a formal dissolution of our partnership signed with my name, a signature that curved too sharply at the capital L, and a cashier's check for $3,000. Stapled to the check was a sticky note in Kayla's handwriting. "Thanks for launching our dream, Mom. This is your share back. Time to rest." Under that, a brochure for an assisted living facility 2 towns over, with a circled price for a semi-private room. My first feeling was not anger, but a sort of dislocation, like the floor had tilted 2 degrees left and nothing would ever sit straight again. I stood there holding the check, the sanding dust still floating in the air, and I heard my mother's voice saying, "Feel the thread, not the noise." I laid the papers on the bench and went back to sanding, back and forth, until the brace was smooth enough to reflect the overhead light. I needed time to think. Within an hour, Kayla's silver Lexus pulled into my driveway. Brad was at the wheel, his polo shirt collar popped like he'd just stepped off a yacht. Kayla came through the door carrying a clipboard and a smile that had no tether to her eyes. She was 41 that year, sharp-jawed and wearing a blazer that cost more than my first table saw. She said, "Mom, we need to get you situated. The business is sold, the new owners take possession Saturday, and we already scheduled the movers to clear out the workshop. Brad found a wonderful facility with a crafting room. You'll love it." Brad nodded behind her, texting, not looking up. He said, "We're just trying to take care of you, Marlene. No stress." I stood there, the check still in my hand. My heart was a fistful of loose string. They started walking through the shop, pointing at tools, already calculating what they could flip. Kayla picked up a fret-slotting jig I'd built from scratch and said, "This looks valuable." Brad opened the drawer where I kept my bending iron and said, "We can list that on eBay." Then Kayla opened the closet where I stored the custom cases for my grandchildren's ukuleles. Each one was hand-painted. Each one contained an instrument with their name inlaid in a ballone. She pulled out the concert case, the one I'd built for my oldest grandson Leo, a deep mahogany case with a worn felt interior. She held it up by its handle, wrinkled her nose, and said, "This thing is junk. The hinges are rusty, toss it." She dropped it into a plastic bin marked "Donate" without even looking inside. That case was the only one I cared about. I let the day pass like fog. I smiled and nodded and accepted a cup of tea from Brad while they packed my life into boxes. When they left to pick up dinner, I slipped the concert case out of the bin and carried it into my sewing room, the one room they hadn't invaded yet because the door was stuck and they didn't have the patience to shove it open. I set the case on my cutting table. The hinges weren't rusty. They were brass, tarnished on purpose for an aged look. The lining was a faded floral cotton, stitched by my mother's hand over 20 years ago. I knew every thread. I'd sewn a hidden compartment between the plywood shell and the padding, sealed with a blind stitch that ran along the bottom seam. The thread was the same gauge as the lining, almost invisible. I took my seam ripper from the drawer, a little tool with a sharp hook that had unpicked 1,000 hems. I turned the case upside down and found the exact spot where the stitch pattern shifted, a tiny irregularity only someone who'd placed it would notice. I slid the ripper under the thread and pulled. The seam opened like a sigh. Inside, between the shell and the felt, was a manila envelope wrapped in wax paper. I slid it out. The wax paper crinkled with the clean, dry scent of preservation. I opened the envelope with steady fingers. There was the original partnership agreement, notarized and signed in blue ink that shimmered under the light. There was a copy of my 401 K liquidation statement with a highlighted line showing the exact $110,000 transferred to our business account. And there, on a thin sheet of onion skin paper, a handwritten note in my mother's cursive, a note I had never seen, written in the final weeks of her life when her hand shook just enough to make the loops tremble. It read, "Kayla's eyes turn to dollar signs when the ledger opens. I've watched her at family dinners counting her plate. Guard your half, child. Trust the stitch, not the smile." I read it 3 times. The 4th time I just held it. My mother had known. She'd watched Kayla the way I had watched her, seeing the hunger beneath the charm. She'd sewn this truth into a case meant for a child who would never know what was hidden beneath his first instrument. Before I continue this story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe a mother's intuition can see what a daughter's greed blinds her to. That night, after the movers had carted away my table saws and my bending iron and my stack of seasoned koa, Kayla and Brad sat me down in their beige living room with a stack of documents. The room smelled like plug-in air freshener and new carpet. Kayla perched on the edge of the sofa, her legs crossed, a gold bracelet catching the lamplight. Brad stood by the window, arms folded, watching me the way you might watch a sick pet. Kayla said, "We just need you to sign this release. It acknowledges you've been fully compensated and you waive any future claim. It's standard, Mom. Then we can move you into the facility and you can relax." I looked at the paper. It was titled Mutual Release and Settlement Agreement, dense with legal jargon, the font small enough to discourage reading. The compensation amount was listed as $3,000. The language included a clause releasing Island Dreams Ukuleles LLC, its members, and assigns from any and all past or future obligations, including any undocumented oral agreements and moral claims. They'd thought of everything except the stitch. I put on my best foggy old woman face, the one I used to use at the upholstery shop when a customer tried to lowball me on a horsehair fill. I hunched my shoulders slightly, let my voice go soft. I said, "My eyes are tired, sweetheart. I need to have my lawyer look at this." Kayla's cheek twitched. She exchanged a glance with Brad so quick, it was almost subliminal. Brad said, "You don't have a lawyer, Marlene." I said, "Then I'll find one, give me a few days." I folded the paper in half, then in quarters, and tucked it into my apron pocket. Kayla's voice tightened. "There's no need for that. You trust me, right? I'm your daughter." I looked at her. The line between her eyebrows was a canyon of irritation. I said, "Of course, honey, I just want to understand it." I patted her hand. My palm was dry and steady, hers was cold. They moved me into their spare room that weekend, a converted home office with a Murphy bed and a window that faced the neighbor's fence. Brad installed a camera in the hallway, a little white dome with a blinking red light. He said it was for security. I noticed it was angled to see both my door and the path to the bathroom. Kayla brought me meals on a tray like I was an invalid, checked my mail before I saw it, and insisted on managing my bank accounts because it's easier this way. She handed me a new flip phone with the explanation that my old smartphone wasn't compatible with their Wi-Fi. I nodded and thanked her. I still had the prepaid phone I'd bought at the drugstore 2 weeks earlier, hidden in the lining of my suitcase, the same place I'd hidden my father's lockpick roll. For 3 days, I shuffled around in slippers and a cardigan, asked the same question twice, and pretended not to hear when they argued in the kitchen. I heard snippets. The original is gone, and file an affidavit of lost document, and once the funds clear. I learned that the music chain, Harmony Haven, had offered $500,000 for the entire business, including my proprietary luthier patterns. the bracing geometry I'd developed by trial and error over 2 decades, the sound hole voicing that gave my instruments a bell-like projection. The chain needed the original notarized partnership agreement to finalize the asset transfer because their due diligence department had flagged the dissolution as irregular. Kayla had only a photocopy with a smudged signature. The sale was frozen. One evening, I heard Brad on his cell phone in the home office, his voice muffled but frantic. He said, "We can't produce the original. Just tell them it's lost. File an affidavit." A pause then, if they pull out, we're on the hook for the capital gains tax and the deposit. We'll lose the house. The loan is at 22%. That was when I knew the timeline was shrinking fast for them and for me. I started my investigation the next morning. I timed Brad's routine for 3 days. He left for his office at 8:15, came back at noon for a protein shake, left again until 6. Kayla went to Pilates at 10 and stayed for a smoothie afterward, returning around 11:30. I had 90 minutes in the morning and a solid block in the afternoon. I began with the garage. Beside the recycling bin was a crosscut shredder, the cheap kind that turns paper into confetti strips. The bin next to it was half full. I knelt and scooped out a handful of the shreddings, laying them on the concrete floor. Using tweezers from my sewing kit, I started piecing fragments together like a jigsaw puzzle. Within 10 minutes, I had reassembled 2 critical items. The first was a corner of a bank statement from an offshore account in the Cayman Islands, account name B&K Holdings LLC, showing a balance of over $80,000. The second was a torn credit application in my name, my social security number printed clearly, for a business line of credit of $100,000, dated 2 months prior. The employment section listed me as the sole proprietor of Island Dreams Ukuleles, with an annual income inflated by 40%. I photographed the fragments, then dropped them back into the bin. The locked filing cabinet was in Brad's home office, a gray 2-drawer Hahn unit with a wafer lock. A wafer lock is the simplest kind, using flat tumblers instead of pins. You can rake it open with a paperclip if you know the feel. I knew the feel. My father was a locksmith for 40 years, and as a kid, I'd sit on his workbench in the back room of his shop, practicing on discarded cylinders. He taught me that a lock is just a puzzle of metal listening for the shear line, and that the tension wrench is more important than the pick because it's the feedback, not the tool. I still had his old tool roll in my sewing kit, a worn leather case with a tension wrench made from a windshield wiper insert and a half-diamond pick ground from a hacksaw blade. I hadn't used them in years, but my hands remembered the ritual. I waited until 10:30, when Kayla was at Pilates and Brad was at his office. I retrieved the tool roll from my suitcase, wrapped in a tea towel, and knelt in front of the cabinet. I inserted the tension wrench into the bottom of the keyway and applied a light clockwise pressure with my thumb. I slid the rake in and out with a fast, jiggling motion, feeling for the click of each wafer. The first pass caught 3 wafers. The second pass caught the last 2. The plug turned with a crisp snap. The drawer slid open. Inside were hanging file folders in meticulous order, the tabs all lined up, Brad's system of control mapped onto paper. I found the original sale contract with Harmony Haven, signed by Kayla, and in the partner line a forgery of my signature. I held it up to the desk lamp. The pen pressure was uniform, no variation in stroke width, the telltale sign of a traced signature. A natural hand lifts slightly on upstrokes, a tracing doesn't. The capital L curved too sharply, the loop of the E closed tight, unlike my open loop. I'd spent a lifetime reading the tension of thread in fabric. I could read the tension of ink on paper the same way. I also found the LLC formation documents for B&K Holdings, listing Kayla and Brad as sole members, and a loan agreement with a predatory lender called Freedom First Capital, $90,000 at 22% annual interest, using my business equipment as collateral. Equipment they'd already sold. I found an email exchange between Kayla and Brad, printed out and dated 6 months earlier, discussing how they would phase Marlene out once the deal closed and let the facility handle the fallout. Kayla had typed, "She'll be comfortable and we'll have the cash. It's a win-win." Brad had replied, "Just make sure the paperwork is clean. I don't want her coming back." I photographed every page with my prepaid phone, no cloud backup, the images stored locally on a micro SD card I kept in the hem of my cardigan. I replaced every folder exactly as I'd found it, aligning the tabs to the millimeter, checking the faint dust pattern on the cabinet top. Then I locked it back and returned to my room. One afternoon, I staged a small accident to test their dependence on me and to justify my continued competence. I tripped on the hallway rug and knocked over a floating shelf that held a potted plant and a Bluetooth speaker. The shelf ripped out of the drywall, leaving 2 gaping holes and a cloud of white dust. When Kayla came home, she stared at it and said, "I'll call a handyman. That's going to cost $200 minimum." I said, "Don't bother. I can fix it." She looked at me like I'd offered to perform brain surgery. She said, "Mom, you haven't done carpentry in decades. Sit down before you hurt yourself." I ignored her. I went to my suitcase, pulled out the small tool bag I'd managed to keep, and found my toggle bolts and a tube of spackle. I'd fixed 1,000 damaged frames and broken legs in the upholstery shop because furniture comes in with hidden disaster. I measured the bracket, marked the new holes, drilled with a bit Brad kept in the garage, and installed the toggle bolts. I spackled the gaps, waited for it to dry, sanded it smooth, and touched up the paint with a sample jar I found under the sink. In 20 minutes, the shelf was back up, stronger than before. Kayla watched from the doorway, her mouth a straight line. Brad came home and didn't even notice. That night, I heard him ask her, "Did she always know how to do that?" And Kayla said, "I don't know." I never paid attention. The next step was the phone call. In the original partnership agreement, the notary block contained a line I'd almost forgotten. All transactions exceeding $100,000 require in-person verification by the designated bank officer, MS, Eleanor Chen, at Pacific Coast Credit Union. My mother had insisted on that clause when we drafted the agreement. She'd said, "I don't trust digital signatures. They're too easy to forge. Put a person in the loop." Pacific Coast Credit Union was a small local institution that still used wet ink ledger cards and knew their members by name. I called from my prepaid phone, sitting on the edge of the Murphy bed with the door locked. Eleanor Chen's voice was brisk but warm, the kind of woman who reads the fine print for fun. I introduced myself and said, "MS. Chen, my name is Marlene Decker. I believe my business has been sold without my consent. I have the original notarized agreement." There was a pause so long I thought the line had dropped. Then she said, "Mrs. Decker, your mother Mabel came to see me 3 weeks before she died. She set up a condition on the account. Any dissolution or asset sale of Island Dreams ukuleles requires both authorized signatories to appear in my office and sign a live verification form. Your daughter called us last month trying to bypass it with a notarized dissolution, but we flagged it because the signatures didn't match our records. The funds from Harmony Haven are in escrow, frozen. They can't be released without your physical presence and your wet signature under oath." I felt a rush of something that was half relief, half grief. My mother had been 3 steps ahead of the people who thought they were 3 steps ahead of me. I asked if there were other relevant files. Eleanor said, "Your mother also left a sealed affidavit to be opened only in the event of a dispute. Can you come in?" I told her I would, and we set a time for the following Tuesday when Kayla had a hair appointment that would keep her away for 2 hours. That meeting was held in a small conference room with a glass wall overlooking the credit union's lobby. Eleanor Chen was a small woman with silver hair and a posture that could conduct an orchestra. She slid a manila envelope across the table. I opened it and read my mother's words, typed but notarized with her signature, redacted of all excess emotion but blazing with clarity. The affidavit stated, "I have reason to believe that my granddaughter Kayla and her husband Bradford intend to misappropriate the assets of Island Dreams ukuleles for personal gain. I have observed them making extravagant purchases they cannot afford and discussing early retirement strategies based on an assumption of control over Marlene's work. In the event that Marlene's share is contested or her signature challenged, this credit union is instructed to lock all associated accounts until law enforcement can investigate. Marlene, if you're reading this, I'm already gone. Use your seam ripper, not your heart." Eleanor explained that to trigger a full financial crimes investigation, she needed the original contract and any corroborating evidence of intent to defraud. I gave her the photographs from Brad's cabinet, the forged signature samples, and the LLC documents. She scanned them all into a secure portal connected to FinCEN and the FBI's white-collar division. Then she said, "We need one more piece. A direct communication that proves intent to defraud you personally. Something that shows they plan to strip your assets and bury you in a facility." I thought about Brad's iPad. I'd seen the Zoom app icon when he'd left it on the kitchen counter, unlocked while he dashed to the restroom. I knew his passcode because I'd glimpsed him type it a dozen times. His birthday, 0813. He stored meeting recordings in the cloud, but there was a local folder of recent Zooms that hadn't uploaded yet. The next morning, I waited until he left for the office, then entered the kitchen. The iPad was in his briefcase, a leather folio he never locked because he believed no one in the house would snoop. I swiped it open, went to the Zoom app, and scrolled through the recordings. I found one titled Harmony Follow-Up 03/15. I plugged in earbuds and hit play. The audio was clear. Kayla's voice. If she pushes back, we can hold her in the facility for a 72-hour psych hold. She's old, she's confused, nobody will question it. The facility administrator owes me a favor from the charity auction. Brad's voice. The signature just needs to look close. We can say her hand shakes. Once the funds clear, we're on a plane to Belize. Then Kayla laughed and said, by the time she figures it out, she'll be drooling in a day room. I recorded that playback using my prepaid phone's voice memo, holding it close to the iPad speaker. The audio was tinny, but every word was distinct. That was the final nail. But before I delivered it, I decided to test them one more time. Not for the investigation, for myself. I needed to know if there was any filament of love left in that woman, any flicker of the girl who used to sit on my workbench and ask me to teach her how to make a sound hole sing. I staged the collapse on a Sunday afternoon when we were all in the living room. I'd practiced it for days. A slow buckling of the knees, a near-silent crumple onto the beige carpet, eyes half-lidded, breathing shallow and ragged. I clutched my chest and said, Kayla, I can't my chest, and I went down. Kayla was sitting on the couch, scrolling her phone. She glanced up. Her expression didn't change. She looked at me on the floor the way you'd look at a spilled glass of water. Then she went back to her phone. Brad came in from the kitchen, a sandwich in his hand. He said, is she breathing? Kayla shrugged. She's always been dramatic. Remember when she fainted at the craft fair because she hadn't eaten? It's just a play for attention. She stood up, stepped over my body with one casual stride, and picked up the release form from the coffee table. She said, if she dies, we'll finally get the house free and clear, no more waiting. She waved the paper. Brad took a bite of his sandwich, chewed, swallowed. He said, we need her signature before she croaks. The notary is available Monday morning. He nudged my shoulder with the toe of his loafer, a dismissive prod, not a kick, just a nudge to see if I'd move. I stayed limp for another 10 seconds, my cheek pressed to the carpet fiber, my heart beat a drum in my ears. I heard Brad say, if she doesn't come to, call 911, but don't let them find the release. Tell them she fell. Then I blinked and groaned, and I came to, clutching my chest and asking for water. Neither of them asked if I was okay. They asked, can you hold a pen? I said yes, my voice a whisper. I knew then that whatever I did next, it would not cost me a single night's sleep. The confrontation was orchestrated with a leaner Chen and an FBI agent named Dahl, a quiet man with traffic cone orange glasses and a wire set that I'd consented to wear. I sewed the microphone into the collar of my blouse, a tiny transmitter with a battery, packed the size of a matchbook tucked into my waistband. The wire had been tested twice. The plan was simple. Harmony Haven had given Kayla and Brad a final ultimatum: produce the verified signatures by end of week or the deal was dead, and they'd sue for the deposit plus damages. Kayla came to my room that evening, all sweetness, her voice dripping with honey that had started to crystallize. She said, Mom, we just need you to come to the credit union tomorrow morning. It's a formality, just a signature so the sale can go through. After that, I promise I'll take care of you forever. You'll never have to worry about anything again. She took my hand. Her fingers were cold. I nodded meekly. All right, sweetheart, whatever you need, I just want to help. I let my voice tremble with what she'd interpret as age, but was actually the effort of not screaming. The next morning we drove to Pacific Coast Credit Union, the three of us in the Lexus. Brad drummed the steering wheel, his jaw tight. Kayla clutched the forged dissolution in a leather portfolio like it was a winning lottery ticket. I sat in the back, my purse on my lap, the original contract folded inside a copy of a gardening magazine. When we walked in, a leaner Chen was at her desk. Agent Dahl sat in an adjoining office, the door slightly open, his hand near his holster. Kayla approached the counter with a bright smile and slid the dissolution and the release toward a leaner. She just needs to sign here and here, Kayla said, tapping the signature lines with a manicured nail. My mother's been a little forgetful lately, so I'm authorized to help her. Alina looked at me. Mrs. Decker, do you understand these documents and consent to sign them freely? I reached into my purse. I felt the magazine, the envelope inside it, the familiar thickness of folded paper. I pulled out the original notarized contract and laid it flat on the counter, right next to Kayla's forgery. The two signatures sat side by side, one traced and hollow, one full of the particular pressure of a living hand. I looked at Kayla. Her smile slid off her face like wet paint. I said, "You stole my retirement. You forged my name. You sold my life's work for $500,000 and mailed me a $3,000 gratitude check and a brochure for a place where you hoped I'd die quietly. But you forgot one string, Kayla. The string that holds it all together is the truth, and I've got it sewn up tight." Kayla's face went the color of drywall. Brad lunged forward, his hand reaching for the contract, but by then Agent Dahl was already out of his chair with two uniformed officers. They came through the side door and recited the Miranda rights while Brad screamed about lawyers and unlawful detention, and Kayla just stared at me, her mouth open, her eyes wide, like I was a stranger she'd never met, which in a way I was. The aftermath rolled out like a slow, satisfying wave. Kayla and Bradford Fincher were charged with 4 federal felonies: wire fraud for the internet-based sale agreement, forgery for my signature, identity theft for the credit application in my name, and conspiracy to commit elder financial exploitation. The Harmony Haven deal was voided immediately, and the escrowed $500,000 was returned to the chain. But their own due diligence failure and their willingness to push the deal without proper verification led to an out-of-court settlement. They paid me an additional $120,000 for negligent facilitation of the attempted asset theft, a sum I accepted without guilt. The business was restored to my sole ownership. I moved back into my workshop, the one they'd tried to empty, and I filled it again with koa and mahogany and the clean scent of shellac. I rebranded the business. The new name came to me while I was restocking the wood rack, 4 strings of fraud ukuleles. The local community embraced it with a kind of grim, approving chuckle. The first batch of instruments under the new brand sold out in a week, driven partly by word of mouth and partly by a local news segment that covered the trial. Kayla's perjury conviction was the scarlet thread woven through the whole thing. During the grand jury proceedings, she testified under oath that she had never forged my signature, that I had willingly signed the dissolution and then regretted it. The original contract and the forensic handwriting analysis proved otherwise. The judge added perjury to the charges, and she received 18 months in a federal facility. Brad got 3 years. As part of Kayla's sentence, she was ordered to perform 200 hours of community service in a manner that constituted direct restitution. I offered her a job. The court approved it. Every weekday from 2 to 4, my daughter reports to my shop floor wearing a blaze orange shirt with block letters on the front that say Strumming Lies. She sands fretboards with 80 grit paper, the most tedious hand-numbing task in luthery, while my actual employees, 2 young women who love the craft, build the instruments. She is not allowed to touch the final product or speak to customers. A camera monitors her station and streams to a compliance officer. I don't watch the feed. I don't gloat. But every time I hear the hiss of sandpaper on rosewood, I think of my mother's needle sliding through felt. The real artistry is in the ukuleles themselves. Each instrument that leaves my shop comes with a history card and a QR code laser-etched onto the inner label. Scan that code, and it takes you to a public records portal containing Kayla's indictment, the forged documents side by side with the originals, the transcript of her perjury admission, and a brief timeline of the fraud. Buyers treat it as a premium feature, a story baked into the wood. They say it gives the instrument soul. I've shipped over 200 ukuleles since the rebrand, and I've received emails from buyers who tell me they scanned the code and felt a strange mixture of anger and triumph. Some of them have their own stories. One evening, after the shop was locked and the sawdust swept, I sat on the porch with my grandson Leo's concert ukulele in my lap, the very one whose case had hidden the contract. Leo is 12 now, and he plays with a tenderness that reminds me of my mother singing in the kitchen. I tuned the instrument to C, felt the strings settle under my fingertips, and strummed a simple 4-note crawl. The resonance was perfect, the sustain clear. I thought about my mother's note, the words "trust the stitch, not the smile." I thought about all the seams I'd sewn in my life, hems on prom dresses, zippers on boat cushions, binding on 100 ukulele cases, and the invisible seam of a family that I'd held together for too long. Some seams you rip open on purpose, and the fabric underneath is stronger for it. My mother knew. She stitched the truth into that case so I could find it when I was ready. I was ready at last. Have you ever discovered a dark secret about someone you trusted completely? How did you handle it? If this story resonated with you, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. Hit the bell icon so you don't miss the next tale of betrayal and redemption. Until next time, keep your eyes open and your seams double-stitched.